All right, we're in the middle of Masechet Hullin, and Daf Nun Zayin Amud Bet. So this is an interesting sugya. This was a story. We'll learn a story now that I don't think I'd ever learned it before, and it surprised me that I'd never learned it before because it touches on a topic that is raised a lot in kind of discussions of hashkafa and things like that, in the context of the natural world and how much permission we have to explore the natural world versus just kind of saying, we take everything on faith and we have kind of a divine command versus being encouraged to explore and kind of have the human intuition to look into things. And there's an interesting story about a particular Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta that we'll learn about. And then I'll kind of divide it into two sections. The first half of the shiur is going to be about a discussion based on what he's trying to do of the moral teaching that's really meant to be derived from it. And then the second half is going to be more discussing the theological or hashkafic implications of what he did. So with that introduction, we'll start. So Hullin and Daf Nun Zayin Amud Bet. So of course, Masechet Hullin, since we're doing just the Agadot, so we don't really ever discuss the core of what the Masechet is about, but Hullin is all about kashrut and treifot and animals. And so a big part of that is the natural world, right? Understanding which types of animals are kasher or not, and what makes something considered a treifa, and a lot of questions that require expertise or understanding of how the natural world works. So, Amru alav Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta, she'askan b'dvarim haya. So Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta was an askan b'dvarim. What does it mean to be an askan b'dvarim? So the way it's translated is an experimenter. So this is brought in the context of a halachic discussion around treifot. And the reason he was experimenting was in order to disprove an opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. That if you have a hen or bird where the down of the bird has been removed, so then that's considered a treifa and it's psula because you assume that there's no feathers on the bird, that it can't survive, and it's considered a treifa and it's pasul. And the tarnagolet talo Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta. So this Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta, he had a tarnagolet, shnitla notza shela, and it had no feathers. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it was pasul because it wouldn't be able to survive. So what did he do? Veinicha b'tanur, he put the hen in an oven, v'tala alea b'matlit shel tarsiim, and he wrapped the hen in an apron of a coppersmith. This kind of heavy coat that's used, people use when they're making like bronze and copper and things like that, and turned on the oven. V'gidla knafayim achronim yoter min rishonim. And then the tarnagolet, the hen, regrew the feathers even larger than what it had beforehand. And so through that, he disproved Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that once a hen loses all of its feathers, it's a treifa. It can't kind of improve or recover from that. And so the Gemara asks, "V'dilma kasavar Rabbi Yehuda treifa mishabachat." Maybe Rabbi Yehuda held that it's okay for a treifa to improve, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a fatal wound. It can get better, but then it will eventually be fatal. So the Gemara responds, "Im ken b'midei demitarafa ba igdila knafayim achronim yoter min rishonim." So the Gemara says, okay, maybe you can make that argument about some other aspect of the animal. So if you say there's a treifa and there's a hole in a particular vital tube, so maybe the animal can improve in another aspect. But you can't say that it can improve in the exact thing that it's a treifa because of. So you can't say, now that it doesn't have feathers, so it's a treifa, and now the feathers grew back even better than before, so that for sure doesn't work, even no matter what. So this is Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta trying to use his experimentation to disprove Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, now the story that's more interesting to us. So my askan b'dvarim. So we say, okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta had this title of the experimenter. Why was he known as the experimenter? So it wasn't because of this story we just said. That's an aside. Amar of Misharasheh dichtiv. It says in Sefer Mishlei Perek Vav, Lech el nimala atzel re'ed rachel v'chakem asher en la katzin shoter u'moshel tachin b'kayetz lachma. So it says in Sefer Mishlei, he's talking to a lazy person, trying to give him musar, to get his act together. So he says, go look at the ant. see how the ant behaves and become wise, because the ant has no katzin, shoter, or moshel. Nobody rules over the ant. All the ants, it's a free-for-all. Tachin bakais lachma, but nevertheless, the ant is able to prepare its food, right? That all the ants are able to work in unison and get their food for the summer, even though there's no ruler showing them what to do. So Amar, Rabbi Shimon Halafta said, malka. So he said, I want to go see if that's true. Is it true that ants don't have a king or a ruler? Azab kufat tamuz. So he went when it was the summer, the heat of the summer. And he took his cloak or his coat and he put it over the anthill. He covered it, and it created shade. Nafak atachad minayhu. One of the ants came out of the anthill. Atnach be simana. And Rabbi Shimon Halafta marked the ant with a sign to distinguish it. And the ant went back into the anthill. Amar lehu nafal tula. And he said to the rest of the ants, there's shade, because the ants like the shade. So they were hiding in the anthill because it was the heat of the summer. He brought with his cloak, he provided shade. So the ant went back into the anthill and said, it's shady now. So nafku va'atu, and all the ants came out of the anthill because now it was shady. Delaye liglime nafal shimsha. So he removed his cloak, and the sun then hit back down on the anthill. Naflu alei v'katlei. So all the ants then went and killed the ant that told them to come out of the anthill. Okay. Amar. So Shimon Halafta said, Shma min, I learned from this. Leit lehu malka. This teaches me that, in fact, Mishlei was correct. There must not be a ruler of the ants. Di'id lehu, because if they had, harmana de malka lo libayu. They would have needed permission from the royal authority in order to team up and kill the ant that had they thought deceived them into going out into the sun. Okay, so that's Rabbi Shimon ben Chalaf. What?
It's an NFT joke.
Yeah. Just to finish the Gemara, Amar le Rav Acha b'rei de Rava le Rav Ashi. V'dilmal malka hava ba'dayu. Maybe the king was one of the ants. How do you know? Maybe the king was there and he was participating in the execution. Inami harmana de malka havu nikide. Or maybe they had gotten permission from the king, and it's not as though you asked them, right? Or inami ben malka de malka le malka hava. Or maybe it was in between reigns of kings. One king had died and they hadn't appointed the next one yet. Tichtiv, it says in Shoftim, Bayimim hahem en melech b'Yisrael, ish ha'isha beinav yaseh. We know when there's no king, so anarchy, everybody does whatever they want. So for all these reasons, how could Rabbi Shimon Halafta conclude from his experiment, in accordance with what Mishlei taught, that ants do not have a ruler? Ella smoch ahimnuta de Shlomo. Rather, just rely on the himnuta is the credibility or the truth of Shlomo HaMelech, who wrote Mishlei. He had Ruach HaKodesh, Rashi says, and just trust that when he said that the ants don't have a ruler, that's enough for you. Okay, so that's the Gemara on Hullin. Okay? Yeah, you're raising your eyebrows a lot. I see you have thoughts. Yeah, why is it interesting?
No, I mean, they're giving him credit, and this title is like someone who knew things because he knew how to do experiments. But he wasn't that great at it.
Because there are all these flaws in his plan.
Yeah. I mean, given this is before the scientific method, it was an official thing, but there were, thinkers in that time.
So it is interesting. I'm glad you mentioned scientific method, because that's really what he's doing here, right? He's saying, I want to prove something, so I'm going to go empirically set up an experiment, an observation, and through that I'll be able to deduce with my faculties the truth value of the thing I'm trying to prove. It's a very scientific approach, and that's why he's known as the Askan.
Approach,
right?
But then at the end, it doesn't necessarily hold up. But he says we don't need the experiment. Really. Right.
So, exactly. So the question I'll pose to you, when the Gemara concludes, this discussion at the end is generations later, right? When it concludes, rely on Shlomo HaMelech, is that because it's rejecting the value of the scientific method for this type of question and just saying, no, if it says it in Mishlei, that's what you need to know? Or is it that really the experiment is good. It just, for technical reasons, it wasn't a successful. You weren't able. But if he had set up an experiment that would have irrefutably concluded that, then you wouldn't have to rely on Shlomo.
And by the way, a funny fact about this. למד הווידאו כל מיני קטע שיצאו נגד הגמרא, זה מכינו סרטון שבהם הם אומרים שיש מלכה לנמלים, just because of the sentence saying there's no melech or ruler for that. So they made a whole video about this, just to show up that the Gemara was saying shtirt. And then and then somebody else said,
there's the queen.
Somebody religious said there's queen, but she's not the ruler. She can give
she
birth.
has the most babies, yeah.
Yeah, she just said she can give birth. She's not the ruler.
She didn't tell them what to do when.
Because she's more of the mom.
I'm just saying it's fine to say in the end of the day, saying to rely on Shlomo, because the whole saying is trying. No, the Gemara is the whole shtiot. Look what they're saying. They have a ruler. What the hell are they talking about?
And then in the end, it was right. You're saying.
Meaning, yeah.
It's funny because that's exactly what happens here, right? He goes to try to prove it, and they say maybe not, and then in the end, anyways, you just end up saying Tov. It was you should have believed it to begin with. Very interesting. Yeah. So that's kind of so that's the question is. So we have here an example of a Tana, and he's obviously a tzaddik, and he's well respected, Rabbi Shimon Halafta, yeah. But he's known as this Askan, and he takes an approach that's very methodological, very rational, very scientific, in the context of why don't you just rely on it because Mishlei says it, yeah. And there seems to be kind of this tension here. So let's keep going. I want to first kind of discuss this idea of the ant and looking at the ant and getting wisdom from the ant. So even leaving aside Rishon and Halafta for a second, but just the Mishlei itself, that's kind of a strange idea, right? Looking at the ant and gleaning from the ant's behavior, something that you're supposed to understand. So we'll see B'dvarim Rabbi, it says as follows, Perek זה שאמר כתוב לך אל הנמלה עצל ראה דרכיה וחכם אשר אין לה קצין שוטר ומשה תכין וקיץ לחמה רגוע בקציר מלאכה. That's the pasuk that we saw. מה ראה שלמה ללמד לעצל מן הנמלה? Why did Shlomo HaMelech think it was valuable to teach a lazy person and give musar to a lazy person from an ant? רבנן אמרי, הנמלה הזו 3 בתים יש לה. Ants have 3 houses. ואינה כונסת בעליון מפני הדלף. But the ants don't go into the upper house because of fear of floods. Not the lower house because of mud. So they build 3 houses, but then the top and the bottom they don't go into, they just go into the middle one. And ants only live for 6 months. Lama, how do I know this? Or why? Excuse me. An animal that doesn't have bones and sinews cannot live more than 6 months. That's what the rabbis claim. And an ant only has to eat 1.5 kernels of grain. But anyways, even though she only needs 1.5 grains to survive, she still goes out in the summer and gathers as much as she possibly can. Way more than that. Why? Why did she do that? Said, maybe, I know that I'm only going to live for 6 months, but maybe Hashem will decide to extend my life, and then I want to make sure that I have enough food for when that happens. Okay, so this level of faith to the point where the ant thinks that its life will be extended, so it's preparing for that eventuality. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. And here, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, Maaseh haya, there was a story, u'matz'u babor shela 300 kor, ma shemachneset min hakayetz l'choref. They found an ant who had gathered 300 kor worth of grain in the summer. 300 kor, just, we'll finish this Dvarim Rabbi, if you just skip down to Hullin Sadi Amud Bet, it's non-hatam, it's taught, tapuach haya be'emtza mizbeach. So in the Ben HaMikdash, there was this big... in the middle where they gathered the ashes from the fires. So that was known as the tapuach. It was kind of this big mound of ashes. Sometimes they had as much as 300 kor of ashes. Amar Rava Guzma. Rava says, don't be ridiculous. 300 kor is this outrageous amount. And when they're taught there was as much as 300 kors worth of ashes on the Mizbeach, it's just exaggerating to say that there's a lot of ashes. So if Rava is saying that 300 kor is an exaggeration when discussing how much ash was on the Mizbeach in the Beit HaMikdash, so to say a single ant gathered that much grain is obviously, very, it's a lot. לפיכך אמר שלמה, back to דברים רבה, לך על נמלה, עצל דרכיה וחכם, אף אתם התקינו לכם מצוות מן העולם הזה לעולם הבא. So what's Shlomo Melech really getting at? When he says, go to the ant and see what the ant does. So just as the ant prepares and gets more food than it needs in the summer and is diligent and has a strong work ethic, so you have to also be zrizin la mitzvot, so that you get reward for olam haba and you prepare for later. But the rabbis say, no, note that the ants do not steal. What does that mean? Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta. Here we see Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta again in the context of knowledge of ants. There was one time an ant dropped a piece of grain. And all the other ants came and smelled the grain. Like, oh, that smells good. But none of the other ants took it. And later that first one came back and took that grain for herself. That there's an honor system, trust between the ants, that even though they have to exert a lot of effort to go get their grain, they don't take grain from anybody else, so you should learn the importance of not stealing from the ants. And Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta is the one who elucidates that through an example. And the whole point here is that the ants know this without a ruler. They just intuitively have an honor system where they don't steal from each other, and they don't have the fear of law saying if you steal something you will get punished. They don't have that. The ants don't have a queen or a king. But you, Bnei Israel, Hashem says, you have rulers, you have judges, you have officers. So for sure you should not steal. If the ant isn't stealing and they have no reason to be kept in check, no one to judge them, but they just do it intuitively, so you, Kal v'chomer, that's the context of this particular midrash, is around the mitzvah to have judges. So we see here that there's a connection of ants to the idea of theft as well, beyond the idea of them just giving of teaching the importance of hard work and doing mitzvot. And this actually comes up. It's also brought by Rabbi Yochanan in Gemara and Eruvin and Avkuch Amud Bet. Rabbi Yochanan, ilmale lo nitna Torah, haynu lemedin sniut mechatul vegezel minemala ve'arayot miyona ve'derech eretz mitarnagol. This in itself is a pretty interesting statement by Rabbi Yochanan. If the Torah had never been given, we still would have been able to have learned the idea of tzniut from a cat, and the idea of not to steal from an ant, which is what we saw, and the idea of not doing arayot from a dove, and the proper way to have relations from a tarnagol. First the tarnagol, make sure to please the mate, and then, So Rabbi Yochanan here is saying that we could learn important midot, even without having been given them from the Torah, but just from looking at animals and seeing how they behave.
We could have morals and ethics without Torah.
That's what he's saying. It is an interesting statement that he's making. He's saying that there is some area where you can just learn things from the world and be able to understand them on your own without having had the Torah.
Wait, isn't that what we're supposed to know anyway? Like it's the whole world is modeled after the Torah. In theory, you should be able to look at the product and see the blueprint, which is what Avram was able to do before the Torah was given.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm. So Rashi in his commentary on this Gemara in Eruvin says, "Dichtiv v'gra b'kayitz lachma ve'en achat gozelet me'achal chaverta." Excuse me. So Rashi connects these two. Rashi connects this idea that we learn not to steal from an ant to that teaching in Mishlei about how the ant gathers its food in the harvest, gathers its food in the summer. And just to finish this idea about the importance of ants and stealing and this and that, Tachin ba'akait lachma agra b'katzir melacha, it says in the Midrash in Mishlei, Rabbi Eliezer sha'al Rabbi Yoshua, Amar lo, Rabbi, pasuk ze ma'u perusho, why is Mishlei telling me about ants and that we should learn wisdom from the ants? Amar lo, hanimala ein la shoter v'lo moshe lahachkima, ants don't have any ruler, ela chachmata mimena, but the ant knows intuitively the wisdom of not to steal and how to gather food. So the wicked should learn from the ant. But the wicked do not do that. Instead, they double down and they're stubborn and they don't do tshuva. Lefikach amar Shlomo al matai atzel tishkav. Right? So, it's meant just not as this nice mashal about the ant, but it's something that's supposed to be then applied to teach me not to steal and also to teach me that I should do mitzvot. Okay. So that's kind of the context around deriving lessons from ants, right? And that's ultimately the goal here, right? The goal for Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta in doing his experiment, it's about to elucidating this point that the ant is supposed to teach me something about how I should live my life, right? That's why this is interesting. And it's important to keep that in mind because even as now we're going to discuss kind of the questions of, if and how you're allowed to go and experiment and how much that's considered, within the scope of what is supposed to be done. It's all for the purpose of then teaching me how I'm supposed to live or to learn lessons from that about how to be a better person, right? It's not just for its own sake. And that's an important thing, of course, to keep in mind. Okay, so a few questions, right? One question which nobody mentioned, which I thought somebody would mention, is that it says in the story of Shimon ben Halafta, he saw one of the ants came out and he marked the ant. So how did he do that? How do you mark an individual ant? So the Eitz Yosef is a bit bothered by this, and he says as follows in the screenshot here. The Eitz Yosef, Amar Izil Echze, the bottom section, HaKoreh al yitpaleh bazeh. So the one who reads this should not be surprised by this story. Ki be'emet ken nimtza b'teva ha'ba'alei chayim shehema mitva'adim lifamim lishpot al eze miminam haporesh b'davar shu neged da'atam. Because we see in the wild, right? He says, if you ever watched, National Geographic, so you see that there are sometimes animals who gather together as a group and punish one of the animals that does something that is not following the herd. That's common behavior in nature. And then he says, but perhaps the ants that are being discussed in this story are not the ants we're familiar with, but they're much bigger ants. Because there's different species of ants. So maybe the ants we're familiar with, Rabbi Shimon Halafta here was talking about much bigger ants, and that's how he was able to mark it or to identify specific ants. Or he used the magnifying glass to look at the ants. And through the magnifying glass, he was able to mark one ant with some sign. So just to be a little bit of academic here, so I checked when was the magnifying glass invented, and so the earliest recorded kind of mention of a magnifying glass, as we know it, is around the 1200s, but there are records of lenses being used well before that, like well before the times of the Tanaim. Anyways, but that's kind of what the Eitz Yosef suggests to try to understand how he could have possibly marked an individual ant. Tosfot is bothered not by the technicals of the story, but he's bothered more by the implication of what Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta is trying to do. And I think this is kind of the key hashkafic point here. If it says it in Mishlei, why are you going and trying to prove it? Don't you know that it's true because it's written in the Tanakh? So Tosfot says as follows. Afal gav dechi hai gavna chashiv be'amocher asfina melagleg gabeh hu talmid amar le Rabbi Yochanan im lo reite lo emanta melagleg al divrei chachamim ata. There's a story told in Bava Batra Daf Ein Hamid Aleph. There's a student who Rabbi Yochanan said something and the student didn't believe him. And he went out and checked it and saw it for himself. This kind of fantastical thing that Rabbi Yochanan had said. Rabbi Yochanan said to the student, the only reason you believed it is because you saw it yourself. You should have believed me when I said it. You are melagleg al divrei chachamim. You're mocking the words of the sages. And that's said derisively. In other words, you should have believed me. So Tosfot says, why isn't that what's happening here? Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta has he received the teaching from Shlomo HaMelech in Mishlei. Why does he feel the need to go out and prove it for himself? Isn't that milagleg? And the answer given is Shani Hacha Sheba Levarer Hadavar Leodia Echad Shlomo. So Tosfot says it's not that he doesn't believe Mishlei and he's trying to disprove it or to kind of find out for himself. He believes it and he's saying, I want to know how it works. I want to understand the mechanism of it.
What the lashon he uses?
What lashon does he use?
Ivadaihu deleslu malka. Is it true?
And also then the ending doesn't really work to say, forget your experiments, just trust him. If you're saying he always trusted him and was just trying to look into it.
Maharsha agrees with you. כתבו התוספות, אף על גב דוחי הגן מחשיב ואומר, עד כאן לשונו והוא דחוק. So Maharsha says, this is not a good Tosfot. Okay? The Shlomo Vadai beruach HaKodesh yada ve'amra. Because for sure it was through Ruach HaKodesh. What, Shimon Halafta needs to prove him right or whatever wrong? Aval nireh de'en ze melagleg. Why isn't this considered mocking? Kamo shekatuv ba'al chovot halevavot. Right, the work chovos halevavos. Bidvarim hatluim be'emunah. When it comes to matters of faith, af she'yada otam beKabbalah. Even if a person received them through Mesorah, through tradition, and he believes them because of that. Tzarich kol adam lachkor otam b'mofet. A person still has certainly a right and even an obligation to go investigate those things himself, even if he received them as a tradition. V'hu shekaro Askan b'dvarim, and that is what it means to be an experimenter. Kegon zu asak v'ra'a Rabbi Shimon Halafta lachkor acharhem lida otam b'mofet. That according to the Chovot Levavot and with the stamp of approval of the Maharsha, just receiving something through Mesorah, through faith or Kabbalah, you still have an obligation to go out and try and enrich that faith with your own understanding, your own reasoning, your own empirical knowledge. And that's what it means to be an Askan B'Dvarim. Again, the way that you would definitely couch this is to say, but it's still rooted in this Kabbalah of believing it to begin with, but you're trying to kind of enrich it and inform it, but that you are encouraged to do that. And you may even have a chovah to do that according to this approach. Okay? The Ben Yoyada, in his commentary, says something a little bit different. He says, Hinei bevadai yesh lo lismoch al divrei Shlomo Melech alav hashalom. Right? The Rabbi Shimon Halafta should have just relied on what it said in Mishlei. V'rak mipnei shepasuk ze ne'emar b'Mishlei, שהוא דברי משל, וככתוב בתחילת הספר משלי שלמה בן דוד, this is a book of parables, okay? לכן נסתפק אם הוא כן בוודאי שאין למלך או דילמה נקיד כן בדברי משל וצחות. In other words, the reason why it's not considered milagleg, the reason why it's okay for him to go check it for himself is a technical reason of the fact that it's found in Sefer Mishlei, and Mishlei is, it's got interwoven parables and real things, and so he didn't know if this was meant literally or metaphorically to teach a lesson. Okay, ואין הדברים כפשוטן. לכך אמר, יזיל איך זה, אי ודאי הוא דלית לו מלכה. So he very much explains the exact language that David Moshe mentioned, where he's trying to say, is this true or not? Not that he's questioning the authority of Shlomo, but he's saying, is it true or not in the sense that is this literally true or just a metaphor? So the Ben Yoyada is a different approach here. But of course, what comes from that is, the implication would be, if it wasn't in Mishlei, if he was trying to prove something that's written in Tehillim or written somewhere else, then maybe it would have been a problem according to this approach, which is very different from what the Maharsha and the Chovot Levavot say. The Yun Yaakov, if we flip back to the
but
picture,
it is the least daichic answer.
His answer.
Yeah, it fits best with the story.
It fits the words most clearly. I agree with you. Yeah. To see if it's true or not, in the sense that was he telling the literal truth or just trying to spin a parable?
You can do that because it's much like.
Right. Very, yep. I think it reads most nicely. I think the Maharsha's ashkafic approach is probably the most in line with what we would generally understand. The Yun Yaakov, in his comments, says as follows: Izil ichzeh, on the left side, Ein betosfot ma shemitartzim, had lo chashiv milagleg v'ain b'maharsha, uve'emet mi'ikara lo kasha mini. So the Yun Yaakov says, I don't even understand what's bothering Tosfot to begin with. She'arei Shlomo tziva ken, lech etzel nimala v'chakem. Lachen mutar lachzeh kevan shetziva lasot ken. The pasuk in Mishlei says, "Go to the ant, lazy person." So he says, "I'm going to the ant." He said the opposite. I'm doing what it says to do. He's fulfilling Shlomo. No, he commanded him to do it. So here, I would argue, the Yun Yaakov is even more specific than Ben Yoyada. At least all of Sefer Mishlei, you can go experiment. But here, it's only if a pasuk says to go do it, then you're allowed to. Otherwise, you wouldn't be allowed to. So he's even more specific. I'll just conclude with the comment of the Marzu here. The Marzu in his commentary on Dvarim Rabbah. Fantastic question. I don't know.
Who else do you know? Ben Yaakov, all of them, do you know them?
A little bit.
The Iyun Yaakov I know is Rabbi Yaakov Reisher, and he's lived in the 1800s, I think, in Russia. Yeah, Iyun Yaakov is one of my favorites. The Marzu is a new one, because he's a commentary on Midrash Rabbah, the Marzu. He's not on the Iyun Yaakov. If you'd like to look up who he was, I would appreciate that. שמאחר שציווה שלמה ברוח הקודש לך אצל נאמנה, עצל ראה דבריו וחכם, חקרו חז"ל על כל דרכי הנאמנה והודיעו לנו באמונתם. So he's commenting on the Midrash and Dvarim Rabbah. Remember the rabbis talked about, it's got 3 houses, and they live for 6 months, and then they do this with their food, and they gather this much and that much. And like, why are Chazal wasting their time telling me about the ants? Like, well, what's the point? So the Marzu says, because Shlomo HaMelech said, go to the ant and learn about the ant, so even though he said it just in the context of the fact that the ants gather their food, Chazal then went and learned about the ants more generally. And then Hodiu lanu be'emunatam, and they taught us, or transmitted what they had learned about the ants to us in good faith. So I think here we see kind of an interesting spectrum between the various commentaries on this. The Gemara itself is a bit ambiguous, and you could interpret it in different ways. We see the commentaries taking it to different approaches in terms of, is it a chovah to do this type of thing? If you to clarify something that is kind of Rasid Ruach HaKodesh, is it perhaps normally forbidden except in particular instances, or is it somewhere in between? And it depends how you understand the Gemara, and probably also kind of what your pre-existing approaches, and that kind of informs how you understand. But I think what is 100% clear, and it's hard to dispute, is that Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta Askan B'Dvarim Haya, that at least for him, there is a value in, maybe in limited cases, maybe more generally, to use human reasoning and to use the tools that we have, maybe even a magnifying glass, to investigate the natural world, because Marabu Masecha Hashem Kulam Chochma Asita.
You see, even here, Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta Maaseh bin Mala. He went again to the ends to see what they're doing.
But I feel like you want to reach a conclusion, but the overwhelming majority of these Mepharshim are like rushing to try and save him from how dare he doubt something, which is quite harsh.
Yeah, you're right. Most of them are. And the Gemara itself, also, I tried to say there's 2 ways to read the conclusion. Either they say you should have just relied on Mishlei and not done this whole thing, or you can say they're only saying that because the experiment wasn't good enough. But I think the simpler answer is, to say, Smoch himnuta de Shlomo. Don't busy yourself with this type of thing. But you're right. The Marasha is a clear and loud minority in the sense of quoting Chovot Levavot and saying you should do this sort of thing, but
like him.
Most of the Mepharshim are a bit more hesitant.
Let's say the mashal from Mishlei said, go look at ants that don't have our intellect, and they don't steal, and they behave in a certain way. Why do we have to have this hook of not having a leader?
No, he's saying
so
because they don't have a leader, they still know how to do it.
They also don't have a brain.
That was the Kavachama. The Kavachama was they don't do things that they shouldn't do, even without having the threat on them. Kavachama, you guys, you have police and judges. You should not
saying
do
they're ants at the end of the day.
So that's the thing, is that there was 2 different points. The point of learning from the ants is because they don't have a ruler. Is about teaching, is to teach the lazy person about work ethic, right? These ants, they're just instinctual, but look at how they prepare their food, so don't be a good for nothing. Totally separately, there's a different teaching. There's a teaching that you can learn about the stealing from the ants, and then we tied them together, like in the Midrash and in the commentaries, to say that the idea of the fact that they don't have a ruler to keep them organized, but they still are able to be diligent and to get their food, can be extended to say, and also the fact that they don't have a ruler, but they don't steal, should teach me that kal v'chomer I shouldn't steal. But it is kind of that jump is made in the Midrash, again, to teach the message of don't be a good for nothing and also don't steal. And, the goal in the end is to learn from the ant, not just in the limited context of Mishlei, but more broadly about how to be somebody who does good things, like not steal. Be a mensch. Be a mensch. Be a mensch. Yeah. Did that make sense?
No, it's just anyway.
Yeah.
There's no other animals that have a strong work ethic.
Like hens, probably.
The lack of leader shouldn't be the Kal B'chaimer. The fact that they're insects should be the Kal B'chaimer. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then the whole investigation is whether they not. This mushal will fall apart if they do have a leader.
Right. You're saying, why does it
They're
matter?
insects. That's the Kal B'chaimer. Insects behave in this way, regardless of a
Maybe
leader
also
or no
Shlomo
leader.
said that because you want you to see something you can actually see. You know, say ants, you have ants all over the place, but if you tell like, go and see, I don't know.
Safari.
Yeah, what will you find?
Okay,
Go to the lions and see
fine,
them.
but there's
What would
still
you do?
the hooking on to the fact that Kal B'chaimer, you have leaders and shaitrim,
Yeah.
is unnecessary. And that's what the whole investigation was about.
All right.
I don't know.
It's a good question. I don't
Might
know.
end this
I
with
don't
more
know if I'm
questions than
allowed to
answers.
look into it or not. I'm just,
Yeah.
if I could
Rely on
experiment
Shlomo.
to
Rely on Shlomo.
find it, yeah.
Just tzaddik b'emunato yichya. Good question. I hear your question. It's a good question. It's really a question on Mishle itself. It's not. It's just the pasuk itself. Lechel nimalat. So go to the ant, lazy one, see its ways. It doesn't have a ruler, but it gets its food. Who cares if it has a ruler or not? Even if it had a ruler who said, go get your food, it's an insect who gets its food. That's impressive. And I should still learn from that not to be
By the way,
lazy.
The sentence that we still use in Hebrew. Like when I was Kita Aleph, Kita Be, we used they told us, all the teachers, go lechana malat tzeir, also like in we use Sifrei Ladim, you see it all the time.
So, every day.
Shkoyach.